Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Graduate Funding. This brief video has been prepared by the Applied Intercultural Arts Research Program and is intended to provide just the right amount of information for those of you who may be getting started on your graduate funding journey. There are several other videos after this, and be sure to check out the whole series. I thought we might get started by talking just a little bit about terminologies. If you're just getting started, these are some terms that you might see thrown around and sometimes even get used interchangeably. As you think about your graduate funding pursuits, you want to think about different types of funding that you can bring together. So you'll see the word grant, and those are specifically monetary awards. They're often tied to a specific purpose or kind of project that is established by the funder. Types of grants include operating grants. You'll see that terminology, but that really primarily pertains to nonprofit organizations. And then, as I mentioned, project grants. Those grants can be awarded to both individuals and organizations. The next kind of funding that you'll see or hear of frequency is people referring to fellowships. A fellowship is usually an unrestricted grant that is not necessarily tied to a specific project, though in order to receive the fellowship, you may be proposing a type of project. Often it's for a specific duration, like 6 months or a semester or an academic year. And they often come with obligations such as teaching or research or other types of expectations that are set by the funder. You'll also see the term residency, and especially in the arts, this is a term that we use with not a lot of clarities. Residencies can be lots of things. Sometimes they're entirely virtual, especially since 2020, they often are in person, embedded in a particular organization. Those are typically awarded by one organization for a specific purpose. So you might see artist residencies where they want someone to come in and offer an after-school program. Or perhaps you're a scholar in residence who's working on a topic or a collection that is important to the organization that created the residency. You'll also want to be cognizant of scholarships, which, especially in undergrad, we have a lot more experience with. But in graduate school, there are still lots of scholarships, especially at a university like the University of Arizona, that could be available to you. Scholarships are generally unrestricted monetary awards. They're usually dispersed either to or through the university. They're often funded based on financial need, applicant identities, field of study, or academic merit. So again, I suspect scholarships are the category that you might be the most familiar with in this list. Then I also wanted to briefly mention that there are different categories. Particularly applies to fellowships. Often you will see terminology like pre-doctoral, doctoral, dissertation, or even postdoc in some situations. And that just indicates where you should be in your graduate school process when you receive those funds. So for clarity, pre-doctoral is often available to prepare you to apply for doctoral school or is in the period up until your comprehensive exams. Doctoral can be often for any period within your PhD academic career. And then you'll often see dissertation funding for which you have to be past comprehensive exams in order to be eligible. And then, as I mentioned, there are also postdoctoral funding opportunities for once you've graduated. But I just wanted to start with sort of, here's an introduction to some terms that you're going to see used. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but really they do have unique meanings. As I mentioned earlier, you want to think about funding as a puzzle, not in that it's some mystery, although that can feel like the case, more because you want to think about how these different pieces fit together. Often there's advice for you to think of starting with some small funding opportunities, often based at the university, and then working to some mid-size project grant, and then working up to a larger perhaps fellowship opportunity. And so really thinking about what different sources are out there that provide funding for graduate school. So we're going to dig into each of these categories in just a moment, but just remember that the University of Arizona has a pretty wide variety of types of support. There's government support, either at the international level, the federal level, state, or local level. There are many foundations that provide doctoral funding or graduate funding. Nonprofit organizations can be a really great source, especially for project funding and partnerships. We'll talk more about that in a separate video. Corporations sometimes will offer funding, and we can talk more about that in a moment. And then this mix, this recipe of different funding sources to support your graduate research and degree program. Never forget about your own personal networks. So as I mentioned, the university does have pretty robust resources. In fact, the next video in this series digs deep on resources that are available through the university. But in general, keep in mind that there are scholarships, which you can usually find through UAccess in Scholarship Uverse. There are assistantships, which are available for a variety of types of work on campus in different programs and centers. And then there are just jobs on campus that can range from federal work study to full-time salaried employee. Grants are available through the university. There are lots of opportunities for partnerships, for programs and projects. And then there's also non-monetary support, such as the campus pantry or through the cultural resource centers or funding for childcare. So that's just one quick glimpse at some of the types of resources that are available here at the U of A. And this is really what we would call low-hanging fruit. So this might be a great place to start. Government funds are also available for a variety of types of work, whether those are fellowships or project grants. There are some at the international level, for example, through UNESCO. At the federal level, there are grants and fellowships available through the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Institutes of Health, National Academy of Sciences, Department of Transportation, also Health and Human Services. Pretty much every major agency in the federal government is going to offer some type of funding to advance their mission. At the state level, there's the Arizona Commission on the Arts, which I encourage you to look at their grant opportunities. And then there's also a position on campus that helps students navigate Arizona's Department of Economic Security. So if you need help with basic living expenses, food, childcare, those kinds of things, that's one way to get support. And then also locally, the Arts Foundation for Tucson and Southern Arizona has a lot of grants and fellowships that it offers, and it also has a pretty great website for other local opportunities. As I mentioned, you also want to be thinking about foundation funding. There are the large public foundations that we're more familiar with, names like Ford Foundation, Mellon Foundation, those kinds of big public foundations. There's also a lot of money in private, small, family foundations. Those can be much more challenging to identify, but that also means that it's presumably statistically more likely to be successful because they have a smaller applicant pool. And then there are also community foundations like the Arizona Community Foundation or the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona that offer various types of funding that could be helpful in your graduate career. As I mentioned, nonprofits are also a great source. Sometimes you'll find service organizations. So there might be a service organization out there that is specifically designed to support people who are doing what you're doing. So if you work in dance, you might want to look at Dance USA. If you're working in opera, you might want to look at Opera America. If you're looking at marching bands, you might want to look at Drum Corps International. So thinking about what are the organizations that exist to support the kinds of work that you're already doing. And then also thinking about nonprofit organizations that we might be more familiar with than service organizations, which can really fall into producer and presenter categories. So in terms of producers, those may be opportunities to help advance the types of projects that you're putting together. Thinking, for example, about the University of Arizona Museum of Art. They're a producer in that they're presenting original work that they're originating. Whereas, for contrast, you might think about Centennial Hall. They are a presenter. The shows that come to them have already been rehearsed and produced, and the sets have been built, and they go up on stage. So as you think about your funding, think about what types of organizations might be out there looking for content that you could help with, might be presenting content that you perhaps have already developed. I'll also take just a moment to prompt you to think about types of corporate funding. I was recently surprised to find that Vantage West, the local credit union, offers scholarships. Those are quite easy to apply for. Sometimes, depending on where you work, your employer may offer funding or a type of support to go back to school, whether that's through direct tuition support or through student loan forgiveness, or perhaps sometimes they may even offer a sabbatical program. So you may be able to take leave from work to pursue your graduate education. And then also thinking about industry. What kinds of corporations are out there doing the work that you're doing? Who stands to benefit from the research that you're interested in? So, for example, if you're interested in healthcare, you should know that Roche Laboratories has an Arizona headquarters. You should know that the Mayo Clinic has an Arizona location. Thinking about who the people are who are doing the applied work that relates to the research that you're doing may also open up some ideas for funding. And then, as I mentioned in the introduction, always keep in mind, who do you already know who has either expressed a willingness or interest to be supportive or might be open to a request? So people who have mentored you throughout your career in previous educational settings, colleagues who you've worked with in previous jobs or your current job, family members. So if you have a parent or a grandparent or someone else who it would be really meaningful for them to see you accomplish this graduate degree, they may be willing to help. Social media is another way to build support for the work that you're doing. I am particularly interested in Patreon right now. So you might think about, if you have a mailing list of 20 or 30 or 40 people who you might ask for some type of support, Patreon allows you to set up giving levels, and you can then create content to keep them in the loop throughout your degree process. And while it may seem like a stretch to get several $100s a month from Patreon from different folks, if you could put together even $200 a month from 3 or 4 supporters, and those don't have to be the same supporters for the entire duration of your career. Maybe it's a year at a time. But if you can get, let's say, $200 a month from a couple of supporters, or even just one supporter, over the course of your degree, that turns out to thousands and thousands of dollars. And so it's just one piece of this overall funding recipe. GoFundMe is also particularly effective for project funding or for concrete expenses. So, for example, you might put together a GoFundMe that provides support for your dissertation research project. And then finally, you also want to think about, what are ways that people can support your work that is not financial? So one example is, if you've got travel that's coming up, do you have someone who might be willing to give you some frequent flyer miles? Do you know somebody who works at a major hotel chain who might be willing to put you on their friends and family list to get you really inexpensive rates at hotels? Could you rent out your guest room to someone and have additional support. So I just really wanted to prompt you to be thinking about lots of different ways that you can support your graduate education. As I mentioned, this is a series of videos. And so the next videos that we have for you start by focusing on supports that are available through the University of Arizona. Then we'll dig into how to find academic funding, like search processes. Then we're going to talk about funding specifically for projects, and then we'll wrap that up with grant writing tips. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions or need any kind of support, feel free to reach out. Thanks so much.